Right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this seminar, which is entitled "The Future Depends on Soil Health." It's great seeing a full room here to discuss a very important subject. I think we all appreciate the multifunctionality of soils. Physically, to sustain machinery operations that allow plants to develop and exploit the nutrients and water, and to produce those healthy crops that meet the specific needs of the end user, be it seed, fresh market, or processing spec. In the past, the AHDB, the different sectors have funded a wide range of work on soil management, and work has been carried forward in two fairly large partnership programs where there's an investment of some 3.5 million across all of the AHDB sectors for 5-year programs that are going to be looking at soil rotations and soil biology and soil health. All of this work that AHDB is developing will be delivered through GREATsoils branding, so be aware that whether you're involved with potatoes, cereals and oilseeds, or horticulture, or you're involved with livestock on the enterprises, all the work that's going to be coming out from AHDB around soils is going to be branded under this area to bring the cross-functionality in the areas all together. So today we have a panel to discuss soil health with you. Two researchers who've been involved with research work that has been funded by AHDB, Anne Bhogal from ADAS and Blair McKenzie from the James Hutton Institute. They will do a couple of introductory talks to set the scene, raise a number of issues and thoughts that perhaps challenge some of your perceptions and thinking around soils. And then we have two board members from the AHDB Potato Board, Jonathan Papworth, who farms near Peterborough, and Michael Welham from Strut and Park Farmers in Essex, who will join as the panel for the panel discussion. So, great panel that we've got, great audience, and I'll pass on to Anne to do the first presentation. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Mike. So I'm just in the next 10 minutes or so just going to give a brief sort of overview of soil health, what we know about it, current state of soils in the UK. And as you're probably aware, it's rather a hot topic at the moment, hitting the headlines across the board. And stimulating a lot of discussion across a variety of platforms, from warnings about how many harvests we have left in our soils, to recently Michael Gove also stepping in to talk about loss of soil fertility. And as a soil scientist, I actually welcome this discussion. In the past, soils have been very much the poorer neighbour to other resources like water and air in terms of attitudes towards soil protection. So it's good to see it in the headlines. So why is all the interest in soil health? Well, a number of threats have been identified in terms of impacts on soils, termed threats. The first one really is the ongoing decline in soil organic matter levels that we're seeing in agricultural soils. This is some data from the last countryside survey that was conducted, albeit 10 years ago now, which shows the change in soil organic matter, soil carbon, across a variety of land uses. And the consistent trend, there's quite a bit of variability there across land uses, but for the arable sector, for crops and weeds, that first little bar you can see with the stars over, that was the only one that showed a significant trend, and that trend is for decline. And that is the case for a number of surveys that have been done of soils in the UK. Why is that important? Well, you're probably all aware of the central role that organic matter plays in the overall functioning of soils. It's been described as the major currency within the soil system, in that it drives all biological processes. So as a food source, as a habitat for soil biology, it drives nutrient cycling. That biology in turn helps soil aggregation, the development of soil structure, and therefore water holder capacity. And it's also an important carbon store for things like climate regulation. Another key threat, obviously, soil erosion. Here's some numbers of soil erosion rates, background levels under semi-natural vegetation, 0.1 to 0.5 tonnes per hectare. As soon as we start cultivating, those figures go up to anything up to 10 tonnes per hectare loss per year. And then when we don't have a crop present, we can get catastrophic erosion events, up to 200 tonnes per hectare per year lost. And that compares to a soil formation rate of only 1 to 2 tonnes per hectare. So we're losing soils much faster than soils are formed. So this not only represents a loss of fertility, but also has impact on watercourses and sedimentation. And then finally, a third key threat for agricultural soils is obviously compaction. Here's a couple of examples. A survey of potato fields, 600 potato fields. About 3/4 of them showed severe levels of compaction, greater than 3 megapascals penetrometer resistance. So that resistance, root elongation is severely reduced to anything like 2 millimetres per day, compared to an uncompacted where you get about 20 millimetres per day root growth. But it's not just potato fields, we're seeing it across the board in agricultural soils. So in grassland soils, a recent survey, 300 grasslands, only 30% of those were considered to be in good structural condition. So this obviously has implications for crop growth, crop productivity, but again also for things like flood risk, infiltration and erosion. And so you probably see that potato rotations have obviously been a bit of associated with all these key threats and seem to be a bit of a culprit in this sense. So when we come to talk about soil health, obviously we're talking about the chemical, the physical, the biological makeup of a soil. And I suppose it's the biological aspect that's got us talking about health, in that you could argue that only living things can be described to have health. And so these properties can be divided into inherent. Those are the kind of things that we can't really do anything about. They're the texture of the soil, the stoniness, the depth of the soil. So they describe the boundaries of that soil biological habitat. Then we have more dynamic properties, which we can do things about. So soil organic matter content, nutrients, biology, we can manipulate those, and that they really describe the nature and the composition of that biological habitat. But on top of that, we mustn't forget the role of the crop in soil health. That has a big impact in terms of what residues are returned, how much residue, the quality of that residue, how much the roots explore the soil, what's happening in the rhizosphere in terms of deposition, and those interactions between plants and the soil through mycorrhizae, from nitrogen fixation, and then obviously the seed bank that's left behind in terms of weeds in particular. So a lot to think about, quite a complex issue. And then when we come to thinking about soil health, these are the kind of questions that we're coming up against. How do we know if our soil is healthy or not? What should we be measuring? How do we interpret those results that we're getting from our different measures? And therefore, once we've interpreted them, is there a benchmark? Is there a threshold below which my soil is deemed to be unhealthy? So it's a complex issue, and the conclusion to some of those questions is there is no one indicator that we can use to cover all those aspects of soil health. And whatever indicator that we do end up using, it's important that we establish a link to function of that soil, whether that function be crop productivity or whether it be something like infiltration capacity, erosion risk. It needs to be an indicator of how that soil will perform. So in terms of the chemical properties, we've got quite a handle on those links to function. If we just simply take Olsen P in the soil, we know that there's a clear relationship between Olsen P levels and yields, and that's where we've derived our index system and fertiliser recommendations. For physical properties, we've also got quite a handle on our understanding of links to function. So here, for example, we've got potato yields on an uncompacted and a compacted soil, so a soil which has a low penetration resistance and one which has a high penetration resistance. You can see clearly where we've got compaction, we've got a reduction in yield. And interestingly, where we've got that compacted soil, there's no response to irrigation, whereas in the uncompacted soil, there is a response to irrigation. But then when it comes to soil biology, that soil health component, our understanding is a little bit more limited because although it's a central component of soils, what do you measure when a teaspoon of soil contains all those different organisms and all those different organisms in huge numbers? And how do we interpret that in terms of functioning? We can try and split it up a bit, and obviously one of the key things we can look at is at the top of that food chain in soils, the sort of earthworms. They're important macrofauna and clearly linked to good soil function because they improve soil structure, they open up pores, they help in organic matter breakdown. So where we have more earthworms, we tend to have healthier soils, but that's not always the case, and not all soils, a sandy soil, won't have any earthworms in. It doesn't mean to say it's not healthy. But then when we come to microbial diversity at the other end of the scale, in the past it's been very much a black box. Not really, we sort of know what goes into it, and we know what comes out, but actually the functioning within it has been a bit of a question mark. However, we're making leaps and bounds now in that area, in the fact that we've got much better methodologies available to help us understand what is going on in that black box. So we can look at a DNA barcode, for example, and look at the genetic makeup to see what species we have present. We can then look at things like enzyme analysis to see the activity and what those species are up to. And then we can also do things like respiration rates to see how active the organisms are. And so that sort of leads beyond just to give a brief introduction to one of the programs of work that AHDB and BBRO are funding, which is in its early stages. It's a 5-year program of research which hopes to unravel some of these issues in terms of what is the role of soil biology in soil health, how do we measure it, how do we monitor it, and what can we do to manage it and manipulate it. So just a very brief summary. Potato rotations obviously are particularly challenging when it comes to soil health, and the threats that I identified obviously often being associated with declining organic matter because of the regular cultivations, erosion and compaction issues. And really, in those kind of rotations, it's really about looking across the whole rotation and doing measures that can build up the resilience of your soils in order that they can perform adequately when potatoes are in play, as it were. And then just to emphasise, soil health is complex. Our understanding of chemistry is quite well advanced. Physics, we're getting there, and biology, well, watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you. If we could move on to Blair.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks all for coming. I'm here, I've given a brief, and what I'm going to try and do is try and be a bit provocative and raise a few questions. So the first thing is a list of what we expect our soils to do in terms of what do we want? We want soft, stable soil, allows roots to grow, stores water, lets water drain, provides organic matter, provides a habitat for the biology, is not contaminated, it's free from pests and disease. It's not really very much to ask of something, is it, to do all those things? The other way of saying it, it's a huge ask to do all those things and do them consistently and well. So we are asking a lot of our soils, but on the counterpoint is that we are feeding a lot of people. We're feeding more people than ever before, so there's some things got to be going right, and you guys deserve a lot of the credit for producing that food. Anne's already mentioned the erosion compaction issue. The winter before last in Scotland, in Aberdeenshire, was particularly challenging. It was the wettest on record for us for a long time, and you can see the consequences with that erosion, and you can see that it's particularly there is associated with wheel tracks. And the second half of the slide is simply a diagram that shows what happens under a tyre as it goes over the soil. If you think about what's happening in the soil, you can see as the tyre goes over, the first bit of the tyre pushes the soil forward and then down, and then bounces back a bit, and then the second tyre of the tractor will push the soil down even further. So the effect of the machinery is very much governed by the axle load, the weight of the machine, but also by the speed and the direction it's going. So there's a shearing effect as well going on. So compaction is not just about the weight of the machine, although that's hugely important, but it's also a case of the movement of the soil forwards and backwards that shakes the structure and makes that compaction easier to occur. One of the things that we are doing in the new grower platform project is to work with a model that some of you have heard me talk about before, the Tyrannomo model, which is a European model for soil compaction. And it allows you, you can go online and pick it under tyrannomo.eu or Google it, you'll find it very easily. And we're trying to develop this and get it suitable for UK soils particularly. So to take it from a general case and put UK data in there. And we're working with our partners in the project, the commercial partners, to put in real potato machinery so we can model the effect of an entire every operation for a potato production. So we can then think about what the soil deformation will occur under each of the operations and say which ones, under which conditions, are most likely to cause problems. So we're working on modelling some of the soil deformation. Where I want to come now is somewhere a bit different. These are some data taken from an experiment in Scotland, which was spring cereals. It had been spring cereals all the way through. And we did it, we simply went out in May, so May when the spring cereal and the spring barley had been sown and was emerged, but not very far up, and we pushed a penetrometer into the soil and measured how far we could get that penetrometer in before the soil became hard. So we first did it after a dry winter. We had 65 years of rainfall data for winter. We know 11-12 was a very dry winter. And we could get the penetrometer in. As you can see, the blue columns are after the dry winter. We then had 2 wet winters, and we've combined the data there, and they're the red bars. And it doesn't matter for different tillage systems, for different amounts of traffic on the soil. Coming back in May, after the crop's been sown, we can see that the penetrometer can get in less far. It's hard. The soil becomes harder earlier, and that's a result associated with the winter. We didn't do it in 14-15 because we didn't have the money. We went But we noticed that the winter of 15-16 in Scotland was by far the wettest on record, 100 millimetres more rain than any other winter we'd had. So we took an opportunity and said, let's go out and see what the consequences of a really wet winter are. And we can see the green bars are the ones that show we get in even less distance. So the effect of the really wet winter is having an effect on how the soil functions as far out as May. And that's a combination of things we think. We know, some from the theory, some from measurements. We know that if you have a really wet soil, it's waterlogged. We know a waterlogged soil is likely to slump. If it slumps, then air can't get in. If you don't get air into the system, then the biology changes from things that use oxygen to things that don't use oxygen. So the anaerobic organisms take over. The earthworms die because they drown, and the other biology takes over. And if you think of wet, waterlogged soils, you'll know the smell, the sulphurous smells and all those things that can happen. So we know there's a consequence of the biology, the physics, and the chemistry all coming together. So we can't, my point is that we can't just take one thing by itself, that the whole thing has a circle. If you then get earthworms back and they make some deeper burrows, then you'll get the better drainage, and you'll have more aeration, and you'll change the system. So that all parts of components have to work together. I got asked to do a couple of very straightforward questions. The benefits of organic matter. These are figures taken from a potato bed where we've measured the bulk density. In the green line is the soil where we've added compost, 35 tonnes of compost for multiple years before we've had production. And you can see that throughout the depth of the potato bed, at surface at 15 centimetres, even at 20 centimetres down into the bed, the soil is less dense by the end of after the crop's well established and before harvest than where we haven't added organic matter. So we can see benefits of adding, in this case, compost. Where I want to go now is to think about one of the other topical issues is other interventions that we can do to help, for example, the soil biology. And it's cover crops. And there are a lot of discussions, a lot of work, a lot of comments going on about cover crops, and I'm not suggesting for 1 minute we have all the answers. We're doing some work on them, and we've been ranging a number of ranges of cover crops. And I think the couple of points I want to make here, we've measured, I've said soil fauna, we've measured earthworms and slugs, and can't see differences as a result of the cover crops. They certainly can help dry the soil in some circumstances, but perhaps not in all, and they can certainly keep cover on the soil and help minimise the erosion risk. But one of the things that we are seeing in the spectra that you can see, the lines you can see, are a soil that had the red line, the soil hasn't had a cover crop, the blue line, the soil has had a cover crop. And we can see some differences in the amount of organic matter, but what becomes perhaps more important is we see a difference in the nature of the organic matter. A couple of the little blips that are arrowed are actually are aligned with protein in the soil, not protein in the crop, but how much protein's in the soil. So if you fed the soil well, it can have not necessarily more organic matter, but a different form of organic matter. And I think we need to start thinking, rather than just saying we've got organic matter, is to think about the differences in that organic matter. We all know that adding poultry manure will give you a very different effect than adding compost, and we need, as scientists, to do much better in describing that organic matter.
Just give that example. What's the scale on the bottom?
It's wave number. It's a spectra. So it's taking energy. It's taking samples of soil, adding energy in a device, and then the molecules vibrate, and the amount of vibration and relaxation they give tells you how much different minerals are there, what different minerals, and what different amounts of organic matter are there. So it's a spectroscopic technique. I'm happy to talk to you about it afterwards and how, but it just shows it's a wave number. One of the questions that's come up is where do potatoes fit into a rotation? And these are some data, simple measures of bulk density from 3 different depths. The green, I think, is there's 3 different depths taken before the potatoes, taken before harvest, after the harvest, next year a wheat crop, next year a wheat stubble, and just as the sugar beet was being sown. And we can see there's a big dip in the bulk density at the surface when we've loosened the soil, the surface soil to make the potato beds. But if I asked you, could you see a trend? Is there a trend or a response to there being potatoes in that rotation? You know, I think most of those lines end up pretty much where they started from. So has the bulk density changed in the long term? So I think one of my comments is, coming back to the earlier point about water and how wet the soil is, I think in some cases, if we're growing potatoes in good conditions, it's not a disaster. It can be a sustainable crop. But if we get bad conditions, if we're trying to do things when the soil's too wet, that's when I suspect the problems start to come. And so, just finishing up, as part of the Great Soils program, there's a project that's funded, led by NIAB CUF, and Mark Allison's here outside, on management of rotation, soil structure and water, and we're working with the soil biology side to try and bring some answers together.
Thanks very much. That's picked up several different aspects. To me, you know, the relationship between machinery operations and organic matter and the role of different types of organic matter was one that came to mind. But questions from the floor, and we'll pass that into the panel and look for the experiences of the grower members of the panel as well. So questions, there's a question at the front. If you could say your name and where you're from so that everybody knows. Thank you.
Eric Anderson, Scottish Agronomy. The very first slide, I think, Anne, you put up was worms. Maybe the second slide, but it featured fairly early on in your presentation. Although worms are related to the biological function of the soil, and they're in the higher trophic levels of organisms within the soil, do you think farmers can identify worm species? There are 27 worm species in the UK, which should be suballocated into different trophic groups. Without doing that, given the temporal and spatial availability in worms within a given field, are worms useful, or are they just for engaging farmers initially?
That's a good question, thank you.
And can you relate that to nematodes, which there are 40 million nematodes per square metre of soil. And given the interstitial value of nematodes, are living in that pore space, are nematodes not a better metric for measuring biological soil quality than worms?
Right, that's a big one. Right, so for earthworms, yes, they're a good, for your comment about engagement with farmers, they're a good tool to get talking about soil biology. That's not I don't deny that at all. Having said that, no, I wouldn't expect farmers to go out and identify what earthworms they've got, but purely just counting the numbers that appear that they've got in, I don't know, they dig a pit and count them for 5 minutes and just see how many they've got is a good indicator. Certainly if they look at comparing it to, say, another field or another part of the field is a good indicator of perhaps the overall biological activity. In terms of species, I would probably say that you could relatively easily identify the deep dwellers, the big, thick, long, lumbricous terrestrial earthworms that are particularly important in opening up and going and burrowing deep down, compared to the more surface ones that just sort of process stuff in the topsoil. So actually, a quick division between that would be a good indicator of the sort of the capacity that you have for opening up the subsoil, But yes, I take your point. No expectation that you'd go out and look at species IDing of earthworms. On the nematodes front, yes, they are a good indicator. Then there's a lot of work, as you're aware of, going on in terms of using them as an indicator of overall soil health, because they represent a whole range of different trophic groups within soils, and also you've got your pests as well that you can measure. But obviously that's going to be a sample off to the lab that a farmer would take, and we're not there yet, I don't think. You can tell me otherwise. In terms of having them as an indicator to say this soil is healthier than another soil, except for pests.
Yeah. Perhaps I could pass to Michael and Jonathan about their views and perspective on worm counts and looking at your farming.
Well, I think that, sorry, Jonathan, I think that question was a little bit over my scientific, technical knowledge on worms, but I think as a business, it's where we come from is it's very important to know a starting point, and to know the starting point of where the state of your soils in terms of the organic matter, in terms of its classification, I think is very important to get a management program in place. I don't know what you think, Jonathan, but that's what we tend to do.
Yeah.
I think it's fair enough hearing all these different pieces of advice, but unless you know where you're starting from and what improvements you've made from the actions that you do, then it's a bit of a waste of time. So that's what we tend to do as a business from that point of view.
So Blair, what about a starting point within particular soils? Where do you start benchmarking your soils to measure changes and improvements or otherwise?
I think with these things, the first thing is to come into what the function is. And earthworms have a function which maybe breakdown of organic matter. Some nematodes have a different function, some are pests, some aren't. So just total numbers of nematodes isn't going to tell you whether it's good or bad.
I was talking about trophic groups.
Even trophic groups aren't going to nail one. They'll nail different functions. I think the point of benchmarking this is to look at trends. I mean, if you take, and the things I've worked with the Monitor Farms, so to go out and put a spade in every, pick your birthday, your wife, your partner's birthday, your child's birthday, and do this, pick 3 or 4 days a year and go out and put a spade in and just do some counts and just keep a record and see whether you can see a trend. Am I getting more earthworms, or is it going down? Yeah. If I've got a crop in the rotation, do I see more after I've had a cover crop in? Do I see more in my conditions after I've had potatoes, or fewer after potatoes, or none after potatoes? Does it come back if I put in, and just build up? It's not. There's no magic number to me. It's a case of looking at trends and keeping some records. We've all got mobile phones now. Even if you can't identify them, put them on a piece of the newspaper and take a photo. Let them go free afterwards, and then you've got the photo. You can save the photo on your computer, and then in a few years' time, get somebody in and have a look at the photos that have gone on for 4 photos a year for 5 years, and you've got your 20 photos. What did I find in a spadeful?
Okay, other questions? Tony?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Tony Bambridge, I'm a farmer. Michael Gove, I think, commented that our soils were drenched in pesticides. I wonder whether there's any scientific confirmation of that from our panellists. And as the board members, do they feel that as an industry we've got such a focus on soil health to such a degree that we're actually creating a view that there is a huge problem, which whilst there are some issues, there's not necessarily a huge problem. So therefore, we may even have a support system that's based on soil health. And if we had a system based on soil health, which has been suggested, what do you think the measures might be?
Can we take the pesticides one first and then come on to the soil health and measures after that?
Yeah, I remember that comment by... So pesticides and our soils being drenched, obviously, it's not my area as such, but all the evidence I've seen is that it's hard to measure an actual impact of those pesticides on the overall biology of the soil. I think because soils are so diverse and there's so many organisms in there, that actually you might knock out one particular part but there's always another group of organisms that will take over that role of whatever that part is doing. So that would be my comment on the drench with pesticides.
I also think as an industry, if we do identify an issue, we act responsibly.
Yeah.
Metallihyde is a case in point. We've set up the Metallihyde Stewardship Group as an industry. We're seeking to manage that as an identified challenge, but that's one key area. But you also look at what evidence there is from the water surveys that the Environment Agency are carrying out. There are low levels of pesticides in the water that you'd expect going through, but there's no evidence that the soils are drenched in pesticides that I'm aware of.
I think we have to, as growers and farmers, certainly in our area where you've got land that is, some would call it potato sick, and we're covering, and people are growing potatoes on very, very small rotations, 3 and 4 year rotations, and smothering it in nematicide. I think you have to question your own, if that's a route of farming sort of thing, you have to, I think, our own behaviour, we need to question it sometimes sort of thing, and I do think it's wrong. I think we should be spreading things out, growing crops on better land, not smothering on as much chemicals, certainly for PCN, as we are at the moment.
Yeah, just add to that, I think with regard to Michael Gove, I think whatever department he gets placed upon, he'd always like to make a scene and a big gestured opening line, which always bothers me somewhat. But I don't think we're naive enough to think there aren't any problems within our soil structure and our practices that we do. And I think, especially in terms of the culture of the last 10, 20 years in farming, where we've been basing our production a lot on short-term contract farming agreements, and where there hasn't been a long-term strategy going forward in terms of the soil, there has been a tendency to kind of mitigate the soil as a medium in which we grow in. So especially in terms of potato growing, where a lot of scalable businesses are renting land on sort of 1 year lets and things, it's very hard to get a long-term perspective on terms of soil management. So in terms of our business, we try and develop a lot more longer-term partnerships with our landlords and to enable better practice going forward. But I think that's be where I'd be coming from on that point of view.
I think one of the other questions you asked was around support mechanisms, and if we're moving potentially to support mechanisms that have an environmental focus and address soils, what would be the measures that could potentially be considered? One that's perhaps comment around organic matter measurement or changes in organic matter. Any thoughts on that as a route for support, and what the issues and challenges would be around that if such a method was proposed?
I think Anne's comment was at the start was we need to link these things to function. So if we want, so rather than, I don't think we'll get to the point where we've got a magic bullet that says this, a score of 326 is a great score. I think what we will do is say, okay, we know that if we have numbers of macrofauna, earthworms, termites, whatever system you're in, then we can talk about how rapidly the initial breakdown of the organic matter will happen. We can talk about, do we have nitrogen fixation? Do we have pests? Do we have, and it's all those functions that we want to get to maintain the soil so that it can continue to produce good quality food, and we need to link much more closely to a function. So will the earthworm give us deeper burrows that will help the drainage situation, or will the mycorrhizal fungi help us aggregate the soil, make it more stable and hold together better when it rains? And I think we have to think about the functions that we want the biology, the physics or the chemistry to deliver.
A couple of questions.
Thanks. Brian Fenton, SRUC, also SAC. We have a test called loss on ignition, which has been going for many years. About 10 years ago, we found was maybe 1,000 farmers looking at loss on ignition scores. You know what I mean? It's basically burning off the carbon. And now it's down to 100 per year. So that test, which would give you general carbon content, seems to be no longer in demand. What do you think about that test, and what do you think about the decline in its use?
So I think loss of ignition is a really good test that farmers can be doing on their fields. It's, as you say, it's simple and it's relatively cheap. And actually, I would certainly be recommending that we went down that route and did it loss of ignition on like a rotational basis, as you would like phosphorus and potassium status, so that you could just see your trends in how your organic matter is changing. I think with any of these, it's the trajectory, it's the direction of change in soil properties that is really important. So, for example, is my organic matter going up? Fantastic. If is it going down? Well, what have I done? And it's changing. In terms of the test itself, I think it has its flaws in terms of a measure of soil carbon, but as a test for a farmer to do on his farm and look at changes over time, I think it does the job.
There's another question back there, and then come to the front again.
Hi, excuse me, Ryan Barrett. I'm the research coordinator with Prince Edward Island Potatoes in Canada. I just had a question about, you talked about cover crops. Wondering from the experience of the folks on the panel, what cover crops have you worked with that show the most benefit in building soil organic matter? And possibly that better gradation of soil organic matter.
Jonathan, Michael?
The only thing we've done is grow mustard in front of, I'm going to come back on my PCN thing here again, where we've had high PCN results. We've tried to grow mustard. Whether there's muck and mystery science in it or not, I don't know. Whether it did reduce the PCN results, but I think, certainly for us, mustard, and once the mustard is harvested and then we have the regrowth and the secondary growth, if we can cultivate that in correctly, so it's just like the old mustard gas was. For us, that's a route that we are taking. And have we had some results? Yes, I think so. Can I be scientific about it? No. So, yeah, we have tried.
Michael, experiences with cover crops?
Yes, cover crops is relatively something new that we've been experimenting with from a practical point of view. Again, we've just grown mustard to cover bare land over winter to stop soil runoff and erosion. But as a method of improving organic matter, I think we tend to use more bulky materials such as compost and things in large amounts to try and change. It's hard to change the organic matter in such a short period of time. It's more of a long-term, sort of 5-10 year process of trying to get the levels up to where we should think they should be.
And there's a great debate about how you should incorporate it as well to get the maximum effect of what you're trying to do from that organic matter as well. And I think that's something that I think there is starting to be science behind, but we are just messing about it at the moment, sort of thing.
Blair, you've had cover crops in some of the
I didn't plant this question, but it's great to hear a Canadian asking it, because you've got Frank Larney's 12-year studies in Alberta just being published now, where he's had cover crops with potatoes in rotations, and he's used cover crops in Canada in conservation potato production with minimised tillage, and he's had oats in before to dry his fields. So we know that the Alberta works well documented scientifically. We know the particular issues in Prince Edward Island with PCN and other pests. We're trying a range of things, but again, it comes down to, with any cover crop, why are you trying to do it? Is it to dry the soil? Is it to increase the organic matter? Is it to try and control erosion? Different things, and it's a case of knowing why you're doing it.
Respond to that very briefly. We are using a bit of mustard as well, mostly for wireworm as opposed to PCN, which has been very important for us. But our biggest challenge is that we have a lack of organic compost. We have a decline in the livestock industry and a lack of availability of that sort of compost and manure. So we've been trying to diversify into like fall cover crops like buckwheat or different forage mixes that have high high biomass, and replacing some of our traditional hay crops that we're just getting mulched with sorghum Sudan and pearl millet and things like that. So, but anyway, I just be, we're still, it's very much trial by error and trying to figure it out. So just interested if anybody over here's got, got it sorted out so we can just do that. Thanks.
Yeah. Any other experiences in the room around cover crop usage? Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, Richard Slary, farmer in Shropshire. We've been doing cover crops for about 7 years prior to potatoes, tried different mixtures, currently settled on a mixture of mustard, oily radish and rocket as a mix. Again, no scientific proof to the results, but very good observational results in particularly massive improvements in workability of the soils with light soils and just better body and moisture retention in the soils. Again, not scientific proof, but with sprang susceptible soils as well, and we see reduced incidence of sprang. Again, not scientific, it's just observational. Ongoing.
But if it makes a difference to your bottom line.
There is...
Yeah, we're getting better yields. Yeah.
There is also, again, non-scientific, and I'm sorry about this, whether white and brown mustard have a different effect as well on back to my PCN. There is debate on, whether it's muck and mystery, I don't know, but, we've had better results, certainly on PCN, reducing with the white mustard and the brown mustard, so I don't know, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good evidence that, both mustards have an effect. It's very much around how the crop is developed, the level of isothiocyanates that are available once you get in incorporation. And there is work ongoing that AHDB is supporting, looking at that, both different mixes and incorporation techniques that is ongoing. Back to
Coming back to loss and ignition, there was a question asked initially that future support mechanisms could be based on soil health, and it's been proposed that loss and ignition by Anne could be a useful matrix in that respect. Loss and ignition, by its very nature, is carbon, and then there's a conversion, empirical conversion to that to soil organic matter. But loss and ignition or carbon doesn't necessarily measure the quality of that organic matter in the soil. Blair, you showed some very interesting wavelength graphs showing differences in the quality of organic matter, and particularly, I presume, relating to the light fraction of soil organic matter. Is that commercially available? And if we're going to have support mechanisms based on organic matter, shouldn't we first of all have a baseline study throughout the UK looking at a matrix which we've got confidence in? Can Anne and Blair comment, please?
Okay, well,
Blair first.
There are a few comments. The infrared spectroscopy is ongoing work. It's being funded as part of work package 3 in the current program. I'm looking to Alice to remember exactly, but there is a program of work to try and better adapt the FTIR spectroscopy method that's being funded as part of the Grower Platform project, and that work is ongoing. And the Jean Robertson, my colleague at James Hutton in Aberdeen, has a lot of experience in doing FTIR, both in agricultural soils, but in sediments and all those sorts of things. And that she fits in with a whole lot of international work on it. Whether we need a whole lot of baseline study, I think before we did that, we have a lot of data existing. If you look back in the records, certainly for Scotland we have the soils databases, but similarly in England, where loss on ignition, because it has been a standard test, we can compare it with a number of other things. So I think before we set out to do a whole lot of new experimental work to try and do it, there's a whole lot of information where loss on ignition has been done, as Brian said, for many years, and those soils will have other things done on them as well. So can we tease out of existing data held by ADAS, by James Hutton, by Cranfield, by Rothamsted? We've got all these data, perhaps to put them together before we set off on a new expedition to use what we have.
Anne, you mentioned the survey was 2007 in terms of last data. I think you made reference to work on compaction that Mark Stalman had done, again, 2007. You know, that's 10 years ago. You know, what's your view and feeling about the way that soils have changed in those past 10 years? Because, you know, this discussion about soil health, soil fertility, increasing organic matter has been going on during all of that time. What are your feelings?
I mean, interestingly, the recent attention to soil health by Michael Gove actually has stimulated a discussion about the fact that the last sort of UK-wide survey of soils was done in 2007, and there are now, I think, as a result of this intervention, measures to do another survey. I think that's on the cards. But that's sort of a monitoring programme for government. I think that's subtly different to what we're talking about here for farmers to do. I mean, government have used it for looking at climate change implications and all that kind of thing. I think we're looking at it from a soil structural point of view, soil water, that kind of thing. My gut reaction is actually we can't, a lot of soils, we can't go much lower in terms of soil organic matter. So we are reaching a equilibrium. That's my gut feeling. Obviously not supported necessarily by the data. Where was I going to go? So, and in terms of loss on ignition and using it as a means to put in support packages, I'm not convinced necessarily that's the way to go. Purely because we can't actually define a level of organic matter which is critical for soil health as such, because it's so variable. It depends on your soil texture, it depends where you are in the country in terms of how wet your soils are. So if we were to, it'd be very dangerous to go to, okay, if my organic matter is below 2%, I'm not going to get paid or something like that. That's crazy. But I do think it's important that we regularly measure organic matter in our soils.
Yeah. So Michael and Jonathan, from a grower's perspective, what's your, if you like, past 10-year view and forward view as to where you would be looking to move with your soil management?
Personally, I think in our area you have to ask the question, is some of the soil knackered? You know, has it been over-farmed? Certainly as other commodity prices drop down, we have been offered more and more potato land, you know, pay good rents for it. You know, are we just pushing the land too much? You know, we certainly got to a point now where we think we'd be better off to grow less potatoes on better land and have a bigger yield. And I do think sometimes, certainly in the fens of Cambridgeshire, the soils have been over-farmed, be that carrots, parsnips, onions. You know, when you've had a rotation of root crops and maybe, you know, a little bit of wheat in there because it's merely a byproduct sort of thing. I think that's where we're, you know, certainly in our area, that's where we've got to now is, you know, we've had to really pick and choose where we go, what we do, and we just need the better land for it to add up. And, you know, we've had an experience this year where we thought the field was good, it wasn't, and we're not going to make any money on it. You know, with just where the job is at the moment, you know, where the potato job is at the moment, we're just not going to make any money on it. And that rather gives you quite a hard kicking, and it just makes you stand back and realise and think, hang on, what are we doing? Let's just ease up a bit here and do the job less, but do it better.
But focus on the soils that will deliver.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And in Essex?
Well, coming from Essex, you show what you grow potatoes into. A lot of people in Suffolk and Norfolk, and they call it mud and not soil. So we have quite a big pressure to manage what we have very well. And for us, it's more about being more precise in what we do. So, you know, in terms of, you know, cultivating as least as possible, so introducing one-pass systems to try and work the soil less, to cultivate shallower, and that has really helped the workability of the soil. We also do a lot of our soil preparation in the autumn and summer the year prior, so a lot of it is done in good conditions. It's just, and logistically, in terms of the enterprise as a whole, we have quite a long lifting program throughout the whole year, rather than trying to grow simply main crop potatoes and lift it in autumn, which we know we're not capable of doing as a business. So it's just about really knowing your capabilities, more attention to detail, and having a long-term view.
Okay. I think on that one, we're coming up against time, so thanks very much to our speakers from the research side and the growers giving the grower perspective. I'd like to join me in thanking them for their contributions. Okay, there is a microsite